Hello, everyone, and welcome back to SCMP Conversations Global Tech. Our next session is a panel discussion titled Healthtech and the Future of Medicine. Joining this panel are Dr. Ricky Chu, the founder and CEO of Phase Scientific, Robert Chu, who's the founder and CEO of Emblema, Grace Park, who is the co-founder and president of DocDoc, and Andy Wong, who is the head of innovation and technology at InvestHK. Moderating this discussion is Elizabeth Chung, who is a senior health reporter with the South China Morning Post. Without further ado, I will pass things over to Liz to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Clark. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at this session on health tech and the future of medicine. I believe the term health tech has been a popular topic in the past decade, and especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected people around the world. It actually showed the needs and importance in speeding up the development of healthcare technology. Today we're delighted to have a wonderful lineup of panelists with people coming from the field of diagnostics, healthcare data analytics, virtual network of healthcare services, and the government to share the insights on this topic. So what I would like to do is, first of all, I'd like to start our discussion on the impact on the pandemic on the fields of our panelists. So Grace, I would like to start with you first, because your company runs this virtual network of healthcare services and does a lot directly with patients. So could you tell us that what changes in the use of patients' services at DocDoc you have seen during the COVID pandemic, or do you see any growth in the use of any particular services for clients in the Southeast Asia region?
Sure, thanks, Liz. Happy to do so, and glad to be here. I think maybe before I answer that, it might make more sense of exactly sharing what DocDoc does. So we're the world's first patient intelligence company. What we have built is this AI platform where we call HOPE. It's the heuristic for outcome, price, and experience. And these are our metrics of quality. And in doing so, we're able to ingest hundreds of data points on a per doctor basis. And then our algorithms are then able to produce a automated report on a per patient basis to be able to match patients to doctors. And our business model is that we're to B2B2C, so we are free to patients, free to doctors, and we partner up with the payers, so insurers or employers, bank assurance in our case. And the purpose of the company actually stemmed from a personal experience in which my daughter needed a liver transplant, but even being an industry insider, having been in corporate for 10 years prior at this stage, I myself had a hard time finding the right doctor. And so the point of DocDoc is to be able to empower patients in their healthcare journey. So what we had seen actually at DocDoc pre-COVID was that in our space, it quite typically took anywhere from 18 to 24 months to be able to have a partnership, sign a deal with these big enterprise companies. And that's largely due to the large organization, its federated organizational structure. And besides getting the buy-in from the operations team who's going to run the partnership, it also required air cover from the top down. And so it's a consensus driven. And so that's why it caused a lot of complexity and oftentimes the longer duration in closing a deal. So post-COVID, I think if you remember initially, there was this overarching fear. Some of the specialties were actually suspended. Elective procedures were on hold. There was this fear that the healthcare system would be overwhelmed. And so being locked out of the healthcare system, doctors and patients, especially in non-COVID related cases, needed a way to be able to connect. And so doing virtually became a solution and became critical. And based on this also, it drove the payer sector to actually take stock in their digital strategy and determine where exactly the gaps lie and how to more effectively, engage now that in-person meetups were not allowed or quite limited. So for DocDoc, what we had seen during COVID was that the sign up and implementation of several pilots throughout Southeast Asia, as well as Hong Kong. And what we had seen precisely is that whereas it took a much longer time period to close a deal, it actually took 2 to 3 months essentially to sign a partnership. And so what I could share is that based on these partnerships, we achieved amazing results just from our doctor discovery services. So, 85% steerage rate. That means that patients chose one of the 3 doctors recommended in their private customized report. And that resulted in over 39% cost savings and a delight score of 72%. And so that means anything above a 50 was actually deemed as a success criteria. And so this means that patients would actually recommend to friends and family and utilization of our platform. So I think moving forward, with these results, what we're seeing is that we're entering into a lot more engagements with payers who have using this time essentially to focus on important strategic versus the urgent reactive needs to speed ahead of their competition in essentially the race, not just to survive, but thrive in the post-pandemic world.
Thanks, Grace. I think what you mentioned is interesting, and I would like to go back later on, like the specialties that are particularly affected during the COVID. But I would like to move on to Roberts now. So Roberts, your company works on healthcare data analytics. So how are the works in your field change? I noticed that actually your company has launched like a customized virtual clinical studies platform to collect and share COVID-19 testing information. Could you share more with us on this regard?
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yes. So at Emblema, we provide software to collect data for clinical research, and obviously because of COVID, one of the first major impact on the clinical research was the pretty much all the clinical trial being halted, right? For the simple reason that participants or patients, could not go to hospitals and see the doctor. So that was a big problem, and I think the whole industry in clinical research pivoted into finding ways of trying to get the data directly from patients while the patient's at home, or somewhere safe. And that's precisely what we did, by building this suite of patient applications and connectors, to other data sources so that we can basically collect data, outside of a hospital. Of course, what's being collected by the investigator as part of the protocol is important, but more and more importantly, how can we collect data outside of this setting, in hospitals, and how can we rely on existing data? So I think that's definitely something that I think we're permanently changed, right? The area of clinical research. Now, in terms of the systems we built, one of the immediate use case was obviously understanding on specific disease communities what was the impact of COVID-19. So very early on, actually in March, end of March, so 15 days after New York City shut down, where we based out of, we partnered with several patient advocacy groups. So for example, Asthma and Allergy Network in the U.S., Multiple Sclerosis Association of America, and to specifically determine what is the impact of COVID on their communities. So the impact is multi-dimensional, if I may say so. First of all, of course, there's an impact on health. So, have you been sick? What are your symptoms? And then there's impact also in your treatment. Have you been able to receive your treatment or your medications? And then little by little, we also found out, right, that there was a lot of impact on, I would say, the employment. Many people lost their jobs. Impact also on, I would say, like mood or even depression in some cases. So I think this valuable information that were collected remotely, right, from the patient directly at home, helped these patient groups to kind of focus on the subsegment of population which was more fragile, more impacted, and provide more support, financial support, or some kind of services, right, so that they could alleviate a little of the pain. So that's what we did last year, and I actually continue to do so, unfortunately, because the crisis is still very well alive here in the U.S.
I think it would be interesting to know more a bit on whether your company has used any innovative ways to collect data. But I will come back to this later on. But also to move on to Ricky too. So Ricky, your company is actually one of the testing contractors for the Hong Kong government. How about at your front? How did the pandemic change in diagnostics and testing?
Right. So we basically at the front row seat in 3 major locations globally to witness, the change of diagnostic and testing throughout the years, because we have our headquarters in Hong Kong, but at the same time, we have teams in both China, mainland China, and California. And since, early last year, we have witnessed, how the pandemic has spread globally and how each of the countries or each of the regions have responded, and all the policies which really have diagnostic and testing front and center, and how does that impact the actual outcomes and the current situation, throughout the year. And I think for my company perspective, right? Initially, when we started the company in 2015, we focused on infectious disease diagnostic. But after 2 years, we get to a certain stage, and then we actually pivot away from infectious disease because of two main reasons. One is the regulation hurdles, right? In order to get diagnostic approved in the United States, you need to go through the FDA, and usually that takes multi-years and multi-million dollars in order to get that. And for a startup that is only 2 years old, it does not make a lot of sense for us in order to get through those hurdles. And that's why we pivot away and focus on cancer diagnostic, and that's when we, set our headquarters here in Hong Kong. But I think for COVID, again, front row seat in witnessing the changes and actually participating in the evolutions of diagnostics of COVID testing, is that basically this COVID pandemic has changed the industry quite permanently, but in the sense that it really dropped the regulatory hurdles as well as the marketing need, because now everyone are forced to do diagnostic of some sort. Everybody now understand what is PCR, what is rapid test, what is point of care test. And this creates tremendous opportunity for us in the industry to really develop different types of diagnostic tools and all the tertiary technologies in order to promote and enforce, diagnostic and testing for the sense of preventions and, beating the pandemic. So I think to be more focused, initially back in the early last year, everybody everywhere in the world are scrambling to increase the lab testing capacity in order to put out fires, right? And there are big fires happening everywhere. China able to put it down very quickly because they have very strong testing capacity. They pull out the whole national power to shut down cities, shut down regions, and make everyone do the testing. And we are very able to quickly identify the patients and stop the waves very, very rapidly. And then in the United States, the testing itself has always been quite cumbersome because you need very stringent regulatory hurdles in order for the labs to perform the test. There are a lot of restrictions, and the accessibility is not that high, so very limited people can test them, and the supply chain is an issue. In the month of March to May, basically the United States have done very little testing, maybe 1/10 or 1/100 of what the Chinese government can do locally, and I think that contributes significantly to the spread of the diseases. Hong Kong is somewhere in the middle because Hong Kong is an international hub, and we can't just shield off the border and stop all economic activity. And naturally, infectious disease definitely is going to spread to some degree. And I think the government did a good job, regardless, how everyone may say, to really limit, the waves to controllable levels. And at the same time, we are keep increasing the testing capacity of the lab. So we are looking for not only novel technologies in terms of diagnostic, but at the same time, the turnaround time, the throughputs all become, the focus point, right? Accuracy is important, but at the same time, you need to think about the economy, how much per test, how fast can you get the test? All this become major topics, which for the longest time, nobody cares or nobody have focus on them. They just want to say, hey, I want something 100%. I want something that is super accurate. I want to make sure everybody can be detected. But then you look at the general population. Hey, if you can only test 2% of the population with the most accurate test, you are still missing 98% of the population, and they are still getting infected. So then the evolution had then changed to more decentralized, lab testing solution, like the point of care test, or even now we are thinking about home use testing. And all these evolutions, because of the pandemic, had forced people to think creatively how we can stop the disease. And again, everybody understand diagnostic and testing has to be the center piece of that, besides vaccines. And this really encouraged the evolutions of the change from decentralizing lab tests to more population-based testing. And now we are going from diagnostic to surveillance and monitoring. And I think this is the future trend. And this may continue to linger in this trend for the next couple of years, if you ask me.
Thank you, Ricky. I think you mentioned the point of regulation. That's something that I would like to go into later on. But finally, I would like to move on to Andy. So, Andy, you are in charge of a team of tech specialists to, attract and facilitate overseas investments in Hong Kong, especially on innovation and technology. So, in terms of attracting these foreign healthcare firms to Hong Kong to set up research operations in Hong Kong, do you see there has been like a change in strategies in terms of attracting these firms?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join this webinar. So I'm Andy Wong from Invest Hong Kong. As Elizabeth mentioned, right? So our role is to attract and assist a foreign company to come to Hong Kong to invest, to build the economy in Hong Kong. To address your question, right? So first of all, Hong Kong has been driving the innovation and technology development very seriously. So a couple of factors that we can see. First of all, the government is providing a lot of funding support for the industry, including some matching fund for corporate who want to do the research with the university or some other companies, right? So there's one-to-one matching fund available. And also some, for the corporate, they can also reduce their R&D cash rebate or tax deduction whenever they put the money into the R&D expenditure. So that's more for the corporate side, more larger scale. And then for the other area, like a startup or scale up, so there will be the technology park called Science Park in Hong Kong or Cyberport. So for those one, they offer different incubation programs to help the startup and scale up to do the R&D in Hong Kong. So that hasn't been changed, right? Since that, and then we see more companies trying to come to Hong Kong to do the R&D because I think it's attractive. It will be in the area of the financial monetary support. Like for example, in the Science Park, right? They do have the Bio program, which is a 4 years program. We talk about 6 million in total for the funding support for during the whole 4 years program. And not just the money support, but also the R&D facility available in Hong Kong to drive that to further develop. Because all those equipment are very expensive. So if you have the shared equipment in Hong Kong, so it really drive the innovation over there. So we talk about the R&D infrastructure in Hong Kong available, and also the talent from the university. As you know that the university in Hong Kong is quite high global ranking globally. So, and also the government is also have some project called Inno Hong Kong project, which is one of them is called Health Inno Hong Kong. The whole idea is to collaborate with different top-notch universities globally to do the basic research in Hong Kong. So that is one of the key drivers as well. And also for those companies who come to Hong Kong in the most recent year, is because of the financial platform in Hong Kong. As you know, in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, they have a new listing rules called 18A, Chapter 18A, which is dedicated for the pharmaceutical company, because we know that the whole journey for the biomedical development is quite long term. So before you make the profit, so that's Chapter 18A will be adoptable for people who can list it in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. That's why we can be the #2 worldwide for the listing in Hong Kong. And some other commercialization as well. Say, for example, the government is do all for the university. First of all, they do have the tax transfer office. So it will help the company, the spin-off company, to commercialize their product with the enterprise. And also the government has the innovation kind of a procurement policy to drive the adoption of technology in Hong Kong as well. So I think to sum up, the momentum of driving the innovation, it hasn't been changed for the last couple of years, and then we're adding more and more effort to try to build the innovation and technology hubs in Hong Kong. Thank you.
I mean, this kind of strategies, I know that they have been implemented by the Hong Kong government a few years ago already. But I mean, with the impact of COVID, has it actually caused any change or in the government's position in attracting types of healthcare firms? For example, I noticed that in Singapore there might be a bit more pharmaceutical research bases there, but then in Hong Kong, did COVID actually make a shift in the patterns of or the types of healthcare firms that Hong Kong wants to attract?
I think the overall we follow the trend, right? So, say for example, we follow the whole customer, the patient journey from the prevention to diagnostic to treatment and also rehabilitation. So, and then leveraging the advanced research in Hong Kong. So we focus on more on the precision medicine. So we through the diagnostic using the AI, for example, one of the AI we've seen our customers using the AI for drug discovery, and also we're using the AI for image analysis. So we're using the AI to help to do the diagnostic, to replace the human error or to replace the human deficiency using the AI. And another one is the company is using on the robots in the hospital, as you see, right? So the robot can be used of infection, and also given the Hong Kong is quite good in the telecommunication. So 5G is already enabled. So you can see that we are using the smart hospital as well. So to drive the telehealth system in Hong Kong. So we're seeing more and more the hospital is trying to adopt the telehealth system to have a remote diagnostic for those patients in Hong Kong as well.
Thank you, Andy. So I'd like to go back to some of the follow-up questions that I have for our panelists. So Grace, earlier you mentioned that, well, actually COVID has also exposed, the needs for speeding up the services for non-COVID services as well. Could you maybe tell us some examples that, like, what specialties are particularly affected and how were they changed during this period of time?
Right. I mean, so you're right. So we did not pivot or shift our strategy to be very specifically COVID centered, because the governments had or health systems had, in countries had very specific protocols for COVID patients. So, for us in the way that we see the healthcare space, this is just a niche. This is only one compared to the other 65 specialties and thousands of other medical conditions and procedures that we actually cover at DocDoc. And we cover about 95% in terms of value and volume. So it's quite there's quite a lot other doctor specialties, conditions, and procedures that are ongoing. So at the end of the day, we ended up staying in our lane, focused on our value proposition. Working with those players that are looking to improve medical outcomes, decrease costs, in light of the medical inflation that's 2 to 3 times higher than general inflation rates, and those that continue on to delight patients. And that's a need that will far outlast the pandemic.
Yeah, so it seems that actually the pandemic has really brought some changes to fields of our of individual panelists. So I want to go back to Robert. So you mentioned that actually your company has kind of have looked for ways, to collect data. Can you tell us if there are like any new innovative approaches in the collection of this data from patients at home?
Sure. Yeah. So one thing we learned very quickly, for the patients to be have trust, right, in the system. Because one of the phenomena when you start sharing your data, you don't want to be like in a Facebook or situation where the data completely escapes you and sometimes is misused, right? So the prereq, and this is really true for all the patient advocacy groups we work with and the patients we work with. The patient needs to be in control of the data, right? Meaning that he has to consent to every data used. This is not a blanket consent. It's for every specific study, every specific view of a researcher or a healthcare professional. And number 2, the patient needs to be able to track at any point of time, have an audit trail of what happened to my data, right? And to enforce this, we actually developed a blockchain, a private blockchain, where we coded, the consent of the patient on our private blockchain. Because the consent, it's a study ID, it's a parameter of data, it's a duration, it's a researcher ID and things like that. So that kind of enforces nothing gets out of our big data repository before checking against the blockchain that this is consistent with the consent. And the second thing we coded in the blockchain is also the audit trail. So we call this the data provenance. So any kind of change of state of the data, processing the data, view of the data, filling missing data, everything is tracked on the blockchain. So the patient can also check, okay, this is consistent with what I agreed with. So that's one innovation we did to basically make sure that the patient is confident, right, that the data is safe. Very, very important feature.
But were any special devices or machines used during this data collection, or was it mainly just like patients inputting the data on the computer and submitted via the internet, something like that?
Yeah, sure. So there's several data types actually we can collect from the patient directly. So obviously the data inputted by the patient, so that's called the patient-reported outcomes. These are surveys, and so this is quite easy to do, so we do it. Then a little bit more difficult to do is to collect the data directly from the medical records in the hospitals. So we also developed, actually before COVID, a set of connectors with the medical record systems, EMRs, from the US hospital system. And we actually do a pull of coded information like medications, procedures, lab results, vital signs. And we do it in FHIR protocol, which is international standard. And we actually won the first prize for technical implementation at the last HL7 developer days. So that's pretty cool. So the patient can pull, right? Basically delegate the consent to us, and we pull automatically, right, all his medical records. So you can imagine a history of medical records for the patient. And then there's also connected devices, right? So depending on the disease, for example, in eczema, we have an Apple Watch, right, that helps the patient track its scratching during the night. So that objectivizes, for example, patient goes see the doctor, I'm really tired, I scratch all night, my quality of life is bad, blah, blah, blah. And then, okay, let's measure it. Well, you scratch 2 hours, so that makes sense, right? So that's one example. The other example we have, for example, for epilepsy, we're running the biggest real-world data network in epilepsy in the US. It's called EDEN, Epilepsy Digital Experience Network, partnership with Epilepsy Foundation. And there's a Fitbit here, to collect sleep and activity data, which are important markers, for epilepsy in terms of seizure prediction and things like that. So yeah, these are examples of ways that patients directly contribute data, into the system, into research.
Thank you. So we see that actually there are changes in each of your field, but do you guys see that these are all good changes that should stay, or would they be like permanent change in your field? And do you see those changes would actually improve patients' experiences in general?
Well, if I may go first, yeah, I think it's permanent, definitely permanent, because we can see the benefits of gathering clinical data from patients themselves. The first benefit is the speed of recruitment and the cost of recruitment. So, for example, clinical trials, you have like a complicated disease where you have like complicated inclusion criteria, right? So you need to look for patients. This typically takes 6 months to 1 year to identify patients that are eligible, and this typically costs like tens of thousands of dollars to have a qualified patient, right? In our case, and we have metrics, right, depending on diseases. For example, I can tell you for eczema, we have a recruitment speed and cost. Well, recruitment speed 100 times faster, and cost is 15 times lower. So that's huge benefit. So why should we stop? Right? We should continue. And the other benefit is actually it's just unbelievable the degree of motivation, energy the patient puts into this exercise with collecting and sharing data. They're just loving doing it. And we have this metric called going beyond and above, right? So patients are asked to do these data collection exercises, part of the protocol, and some patients do more, right? And in our case, 29% of the patients do actually more. So it shows that they want to go beyond. They want to be directly connected to research. They want to receive insights from the research, not in 5 years, but next week, right, from the community. And I think this is an energy, a power source that's so important, so faster, so much faster and so much cheaper. and the data quality is really excellent. By the way, our platform is used by the FDA, in terms of regulatory approval, so it's regulatory grade data. Of course, the data claim for patients included. So I think this is a major factor that is changing and improving and accelerating clinical research in general, in my opinion.
Ricky, how about you? Because I'm just wondering that your company at first was dealing with cancer diagnostics, and then during COVID changed to COVID testing. With these changes, I mean, do you see that there might be a danger that need of patients who are actually might need cancer diagnostics or maybe other infectious disease testing, their needs might not be addressed because of this kind of shift of services?
I think this is definitely to the benefit of the patient, and that has always been the center theme of our company, to trying to empower patients or everyone so that they can understand their body situation better, their health condition better, instead of waiting till when disease actually happens or when you get into a serious conditions before you go seek help. Because for the longest time, diagnostic has not been emphasized in the entire healthcare chain. Treatment is, right? But I think, for the COVID, that forced everyone to think about, hey, when you have something that is unknown, the first layer of defense is actually diagnostic when vaccines or treatment is not available, right? And that's the same logic can apply to many different conditions, cancer per se, right? If you can detect cancer earlier, your survival rate is way higher than when you were detected much later, right? And same thing goes for any other, many infectious diseases. So I think these COVID lessons have educated everybody the importance of early detection, the importance of diagnostics, and the importance of actually enabling, telemedicine. That is something that in the field we have been talking for years and has not really been enforced or has not been implemented. I think one of the key missing piece is the fact that you can actually do diagnostic at home and provide accurate and useful data back to the physicians for them to make assessment, right? Right now, telemedicine is only good for skincare because, through FaceTime or video chat, they can actually look at your skin condition and the doctor can make assessment and give you treatment remotely, right? But anything else, you can't really do that. But I think as the advance of the diagnostic technologies is getting better, we can truly and finally enable, telemedicine to some degree. And I think that evolution, again, is not going to go back. And I think everybody, once you get a taste of that, we think everybody would enjoy it, and that become with the what the future trend is all about, look like.
You earlier mentioned that because of COVID, it actually pushed the sector to develop some sort of like home use testing or maybe a point of care testing, something like that. But I mean, what is the magic here in COVID that make this kind of changes? Was it because, in the past, was it because of the lack of technology in develop this kind of more convenient testing services? What are the reasons that could push this kind of change?
I think technology advancement is a huge thing. And actually, for the past year, we have seen tremendous resource from the government and private sector to pour into the field to accelerate the process. For example, when US is spending a lot of optics and resource on the vaccine development, but maybe a little bit less, on the spotlight is they also spend billions of dollars in research of rapid diagnostics. In fact, last summer, they have a program called RADx, which they use the same logic as the Manhattan Project, where they want to spend $20 billion in 3 months, want to accelerate the rapid diagnostic development. And out of 600, companies applied for that, and only a handful were selected and do that. Our company was one of them, honorably. But this really showed the government's strength and focus and pouring in resource, hoping to accelerate the development of these technologies. And everybody, in the field recognize the benefit of something that is convenient, fast, and easy to use, something that you can do in a resource-poor setting like at home.
Thanks, Ricky. Well, I think many people, they would agree that COVID-19 was indeed like an accelerator to push the healthcare industry to embrace more technological advancements. But I mean, do you think that actually healthcare has been slower than other industries in the adaptation of tech before COVID? I'm curious to know what do you guys think about it?
Yeah, I mean, if I can start, yeah, sure. I mean, definitely, you know, there's interesting metrics, like for example, when you take pharmaceutical companies and versus different industries, you know, adopting CRMs, you know, customer relationship management system. So typically this happened in like the late 90s, and then on the cloud, you know, in 2010, and then pharma industry typically is 10 years behind, right? So that's a sign of late adoption of technology. And then, you know, there's, I think, regulation definitely, you know, sometimes does not help, to Ricky's point, for adoption of technology. And then culture, you know, because this is a world where, you know, you have doctors, you have professors, academia, regulators, you know, and they have their own way of doing things. They're not necessarily very tech savvy, you know, and I think obviously, you know, COVID was dramatically, you know, impactful negatively, but I think one of the positive impacts is definitely, you know, accelerating the adoption of technology and forcing people basically to change the way they see things and they work. So that's a good thing, you know, after all.
Grace, your company is the first patient data intelligence company. Did you find any problems in pushing the services when you first launched your company?
Sure. I mean, you know, I could answer that question, Liz, and also piggyback on what was just shared. Is that, you know, I think one of the key things about the healthcare ecosystem is that patients do not have a powerful unified platform to influence the other stakeholders. The other stakeholders, whether you're a doctor or a, you know, hospital group or a pharmaceutical medical devices or the payer groups, each of them actually have a very powerful unified platform, associations, groups that are well set up to meet the needs to be implemented into policies. And so, you know, I think that that is where for healthcare startups that actually focus in on empowering patients, you know, there is quite a bit of challenge. You know, how do you have that strong unified platform for empowering patients? And you know, so in terms of just the topic of our panel today, you know, in terms of the tech ecosystem or what adoptions have been in place, I think the bigger question is what kind of tech advancements are we talking about? Because at the end of the day, COVID was a crisis, and the payers are bifurcated into two separate types of reactions or types of advancements that they chose to pursue. On the one side, you know, tech advancements, you know, remains in the analog approach, and then you add a digital component to it. So, for example, in the insurance space, it's heavily paper-based, and it has been for years, for decades. And so moved on to PDFs, and then now for the PDFs, now that you can't meet people in person, you know, tack on a e-signature instead. And so this is an incremental change in my mind. But for some, it was defined as their digital transformation. On the other side of this bifurcation, the other approach is truly taking a digital first approach, paperless. You know, you can put data into a web product that's machine readable, highly structured database, and completing real-time claims adjudication. You know, a payment is happening instantaneously. And so for, you know, just reflecting in this space in healthcare, I think those that take the time to make meaningful digital transformation will truly come out stronger in the long run.
But how do you assess the attitude of patients as well? Are they ready to embrace this kind of changes, this digital transformation or technological advancements in the services?
Oh, yes. I mean, when we actually receive the feedback from patients, you know, our Net Promoter Score is 88. And they're the shock of and surprise saying that, wow, we can actually have this kind of information readily available to make wiser choices, you know, make better decisions. They had thought, you know, it's just the way it is in healthcare. We just can't get this information, right? We can't make, it's just, we have to rely on anecdotes or other people's opinions on who to go see or what needs to be done, or it just cannot be done in healthcare. It's just the way it is. And so I think having that light bulb go off and seeing firsthand these private customized reports, data that they could make choices has been embraced. And finally, it's an opportunity for patients to be empowered.
See. I'd like to move on to the role of the government, because Ricky, earlier you mentioned that the regulatory hurdle was one of the reasons that your company could not further develop infectious disease testing services. I'm just wondering that what is the role of the government? How could policies facilitate the development of healthcare tech in your jurisdictions? How could the government help?
Well, the government role is really to assess, the performance, the safety of the medical device before it can be released as a product or to the general populations, or at least to restrict, the claims or the usage under certain suitable conditions. That's the role of the government, hence the regulations, right? And I think and because of these guidelines, for example, in the United States has been set, for a long time, right? And when you have a policy that is mature, that you have established, whenever you have changed, you have inertia, and that's why in the field of diagnostic or in the field of point of care or even home use tests, FDA has not been really open about that until when there are crises, right? And FDA understand that, the world's on fire, you really have to get more tools to the market in order to put out fires. And overnight, they changed the policy to put the emergency use authorization that allows, everybody with sufficient data and get very speedy approval, because they put all their resources in looking into the application and get them very speedy approval. And I think that is a very good understanding and balancing, controlling the product that could be in the market versus, the control from the government, ensuring that the product are not doing any harm to the populations. And I think, but however, because of these regulation restrictions, the rollout of the tools are still, not catching up with the development of the pandemic. And but it's still moving on in a good direction, I think. Right, and then you have other situations, let's say in Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong doesn't have an FDA body, and for the longest time, how the government decide to use whatever product is to piggyback on, let's say, FDA or the NMPA in China or the CE mark in Europe. And usually the general guideline is, hey, you may need to get both FDA and CE before we would consider to use that in Hong Kong. Again, when Hong Kong is on fire, you need to make some flexibility adjustment. Right, and what they do, and particularly in our case, is we got CE mark, but we are still waiting in line for FDA. The government is willing to use their resources to actually assess our products or other products in their own lab. Right, they are basically doing, our job. In FDA, we need to provide all the data and submit to the government, and the government would, make the decision. In Hong Kong, we give them the product, and they are the one to do all the assessment and do the comparison with other product, and then they make their own decisions, right? And I think the crisis has actually made the government to be more flexible, to be more understanding. And after they put a leap of faith, if I may, on approving certain product, and they see the benefit and they see the real-time data, that actually facilitate their education or their understanding into further adjustment of their policy in the future, I think. So overall, I think through this lesson, not only the industry are learning, the government is also learning.
Thank you, Ricky. So Andy, I wonder that in your experiences when, attracting, those overseas healthcare tech firms coming to Hong Kong, have you encountered any examples that any firms that they withdrew at the last minute because of the regulatory hurdles in Hong Kong, or maybe the policies in Hong Kong are not friendly enough for them to implement the research or the operations here?
I'm lucky that so far I haven't seen a company who withdraw at the last minute, but I do think that they still spend quite a fair amount of time to understand how the market works in Hong Kong. Because of, for example, they try to understand the regulatory, what's the difference between Hong Kong and the USA, for example. As Ricky mentioned about the kind of approved, for example, medical device. In Hong Kong, it follow whether we have the FDA or CE mark in Hong Kong, and it depends on the key opinion leader to use this device in Hong Kong. So they need to understand the regulatory difference between Hong Kong and the other place. And also they also look at the opportunity between Hong Kong and Greater Bay Area, because that is a major driver for those companies who want to establish their business in Hong Kong, not only for the Hong Kong, but also what are the benefits of having the device already in Hong Kong, whether it will be easier to access to the Greater Bay Area, for example. And I think that's a good driver because Hong Kong have a very good ecosystem. Say, for example, we have been talking to one of the companies who providing a point of care unit, which can be doing a multiple testing in a single unit. And it reduces the cost and reduces the time. And given that Hong Kong have a good a telco network and also the insurance company add up together, so it can form a very good telehealth system in Hong Kong for the patient to use it. And then once they launch in Hong Kong, they would hope that it can be used in China also. So I think we haven't seen that it will be withdrawn in the last minute, but it will take more time to study the feasibility of the product in Hong Kong and explore the opportunity more further in China area.
But have you ever received any opinions from those healthcare tech firms that maybe there is some areas that other countries they are doing better in terms of regulation or government policies, but then in Hong Kong maybe more improvements will be needed? Have you ever heard of this kind of opinions as well?
Yeah. I think that's for the medical device, right? So as I mentioned earlier, it's still not necessary to get a certain approval. We rely on the approval being done in the other countries to use it, but maybe in the pharmaceutical area, then because we also follow the other country, as long as you have two approval from maybe from the Europe or maybe from the US, then it can be used. The drugs can be used in Hong Kong. So we are more following up the other country approach. I think one of the reasons because we talk about 7 million population in Hong Kong. So if you have to go for all those tests just for the 7 million population in Hong Kong, that may not be justified. So we adopted the following the other countries' approval procedures. That make more sense for Hong Kong. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. How about Grace? I would like to know your view as well. In Singapore, do you think there anything that the government could help in speeding up the adaptation of healthcare tech as well?
I would go back to my earlier point in that, yes, I do believe in terms of regulatory policies to empower patients can be a role in which governments can play. Again, I believe that in this ecosystem, the forgotten stakeholder oftentimes is the patient. And so the others are well coordinated, whether you're the doctor association, hospital group, payer groups, pharma, you name it. And there are robust regulations there to oftentimes just protect these stakeholders and kept it the way it is, the status quo. And so, it makes it more challenging for health tech companies to empower patients to address the real pain points in the sector. So, so I think that's really where the role that governments can play is to help in these regulations and look at existing policies that are in place right now and see it in the lens of a patient now today. Is it really enhancing and empowering them, or is it not so?
See. So, I mean, it seems that our discussion has touched on quite a lot of positive changes that we have seen in healthcare tech from COVID. But in your areas, do you think that there are actually more that could be that have not been touched, and maybe further improvements could be made when looking ahead, and especially based on the experiences we had in the past year? Perhaps, Robert, could you maybe share? Do you have any views on this as well?
Sure. I think in the continuation of the regulations, so on. So we're a little bit biased because we work very closely with the FDA. We license them our X platform, and they basically perform all the analysis, on the raw data, raw genomic data, for example, at CDRH for the companion diagnostics. And I think the important point is that it takes time for sure. It's an expense for sure, but FDA is a data-driven organization, and the science speaks, right? And I think this is a very big difference versus the other regulatory bodies where they just take the claim, right, and then some KOLs, right, put an opinion and they vote, and then that's it, right? But they don't verify the data science behind it, right? So I think this is why very, very often they rely on FDA. And my opinion, was acceleration of data collection directly to patients, patient empowerment, that Grace was talking about. I think we should extend this data-driven, science to even further, right, to include all kinds of data. So data coming from not only clinical trials, but coming from patients themselves, all the medical records, the claims data, so what we call real-world data. And ultimately, if we do this correctly, there's this whole thesis, that's called the synthetic control arm, which is to reduce the number of patients actually you need in a clinical trial, right, which is the gold standard. And that's how you can basically, cut in two, right, the duration, get new drugs faster. So I think more data is good, and COVID allows us to prove that actually this more data thesis works very, very well. And then we need to provide the technology to support the analysis, the analytics. So I think I'm being very, very optimistic, in the future of clinical research because of these reasons.
Thanks, Robert. How about Ricky? So you mentioned that, well, actually, COVID has changed its public attitude on diagnostics, especially in this whole healthcare system. But are there any kind of things that we need to do further in this area as well?
Yeah, I think now that we understand, understanding our own health, we control our own health information could be very beneficial to our own health, right? And moving on further, then I think it is time to really think about what in other aspect of your health, can be monitored under certain conditions, right? And for example, mental health, or for example, other slow diseases. Like all this actually make more sense to go for decentralized settings where you can monitor your own condition remotely while reporting, frequently back the data back to the healthcare physicians. I think again, this COVID pandemic exercise have allowed, regulatory levels or from the consumer levels, understanding the needs for such evolutions. And now it's really to think about beyond just the technological advancement in policy-wise, logistic-wise, from the IT point of view, from the data privacy point of view, how can we also evolve and allow, such, inevitable trend to happen?
How about Grace? Do you have any specific views on this as well, on what further could be done, perhaps on this specific patients, doctors, network services platform?
Sure. We've just scratched the surface in implementing tech solutions in healthcare. Healthcare is such a massive sector, and there's so many ways of disrupting and transforming it. And I think more competition will only make the sector a lot more robust. And I won't go into data. Again, I believe that's the new currency of this era. That is what we need to be able to, and be able to make it interoperable, to learn from each other, because today it's highly siloed and fragmented. In terms of opportunities, I don't see anybody else in the marketplace doing the things that we're doing at DocDoc in terms of doctor discovery using coded concepts, and then in the procedure and condition level of granularity, and then tying that up with a claims adjudication process and real-time payouts. But I think in other areas that I may see, and there's so many, but if I were just to name a couple others, other areas could be, if 70% or so of chronic diseases stem from lifestyle choices, we just need to be a lot more effective in the way that influences good behavior, such as eating well, sleeping right, exercising. I think somebody mentioned already wellness. Another example could be about patient adherence programs, important to ensure compliance of medicines. We're losing trillions of dollars, and it's adding a lot more stress to the healthcare system based on lack of compliance. And so being able to touch base with the patients and effectively be able to adhere to medications, things of that nature, I think is a great opportunity as well. There's so many more.
Thanks, Grace. So finally, Andy, you mentioned that actually COVID hasn't caused much change in the strategies in attracting healthcare tech firms. But I mean, looking forward, I mean, does the government have any plan in kind of shifting the direction in the development, this whole IT development policy, taking into account of the experiences that we had in the past year? Is there such a plan here at the moment?
Yeah, maybe I would like to highlight one of the project. Maybe most people are already aware of. It's the Genomes project. So it launched in last year in May, right? So it's a Hong Kong Genomes project, or they set up a Genomes institution. So it divided into two different phases. Phase one is to collect 2,000 patients DNA full sequencing data, and then over the next couple of years, we'll have another 18,000 of patients full sequencing data. So the overall is to build a database for the genomes analysis. And I think that will be a major milestone to collect all those genome data, particularly for the rare disease. In addition to that, I think the Science Park really is a platform to help the advanced development of the healthcare, particularly in the AI part. For example, one of our clients doing the drug discovery. So the whole idea is to using the AI analytical method to shorten the time to discover the novel drugs in this case. So it minimized the time it takes for the traditional way, doing all those molecule analysis, and then it will save the cost. So it definitely will shorten the overall lifetime of drug development, and also we will have a better chance of success. Thank you.
So I think we've touched on most of the questions that we would like to address in this panel. Thank you very much, everyone. I've learned a great deal from the diverse views of people from different aspects within this healthcare sector. So I'll pass the time back to Clark now. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. And yes, I'll just piggyback on what you said. Thank you so much to all the panelists for taking the time out to share their thoughts and expertise with us. Grace, Ricky, Robert, and Andy. And of course, thank you to Elizabeth for moderating the discussion as well. And before we go, just need to give a final thank you to our gold sponsor for this event, Invest HK. We hope everyone enjoyed this talk and learned as much as I did, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next webinar we hold. Thank you, everyone.